This week we'd like to look at Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. And as you can probably imagine, there is something very peculiar about this place. This probably the most startling observation that external observers make is the discrepancy between a very traditional society clinging to old ways of arranging social affairs, and at the same time it's super modern, super new. Is a very, very large degree of conspicuous consumption of cities that are extremely modern looking. So this tension and this discrepancy between the very old and the very new in one place is one of the characteristics in the region that we will try to explore this week. The region is at the same time, it's the heartland of Islam, both geographically and spiritually. Geographically is obvious when you look at the map, but spiritually also because it's the center of the two key, the most holy sites of Islam, and also the region from which the Prophet started his propagation of this new religion, something that we discussed in the first week. Here you see the Kaaba, the central focus of the annual pilgrimage that Muslims have to undertake, and in a sense the very geographical center of Islam. And this was an old image, and here you see the current shrine that has been built around it to accommodate the annual pilgrimage, which is now a very, very large affair, and something which is a tremendous source of pride and legitimacy for the Saudi government that is in charge of these two holy shrines, as reflected in one of the official titles of the Saudi king, who calls himself the custodian of the two holy shrines. The dualism that I just referred to, this tension between the old social relations and the modern way of life, is reflected in the characteristic of all of these societies in the Arabian Peninsula, with the possible exception of Yemen and slightly less Oman, because they're slightly less rich than the others. But all of them are very avid importers of Western consumer goods, Western weaponry. Here you see a cityscape in Dubai, the annual camel race, and in the back the skyscrapers that have been built up. And here you see a Saudi F-15 fighter plane. And these two things, the conspicuous consumption and the importation of Western weaponry and Western protection, these are two of the things that characterize the tension that exists in this region. And it raises the obvious question, and you might have probably already thought about this: how does this work out in practice to have a society that claims to be very traditional, that does not want its social norms or organizational structures changed, that does not adopt the dominant pattern that exists in the world, yet at the same time tries to live in a modern environment? Here you see an Arab family, a Khaliji family probably, given the dress of the ladies, in some Western tourist spot. So they are living in the modern world, but they don't want to be part of the modern world. And the question is whether this works out without tension. And I leave that to your imagination and to your exploration in this week as we jointly look at this region to see whether this is a process that works out well, or whether there remain tensions that remain unresolved. Perhaps the most startling and most commented upon feature of these societies is the role of women in public life. You have on the one hand a very modern, Western-looking society, as you see here, a city that is full of skyscrapers and all the modern conveniences of modern life. Yet you have very stark restrictions on the on the lives of women, perhaps best symbolized in the prohibition of driving that most women are subjected, all women are subjected in most of these societies on the Arabian Peninsula. And at this point, it might be useful to point out the difference between truly genuinely religious prescription and cultural patterns that exist, and the role of custom, urf, in the development of Islamic law, something that we had referred to in the first week. So the Arabian tribal society has a particular role and a particular expectation of what constitutes proper female behavior. And that, as we already mentioned, is very different from the role women are perceived and the functions they serve in society in many of the other Islamic societies. So here we need to distinguish between cultural patterns and truly religious dogmas. And one of the things that's also important to pay attention to is that the exclusion of women from public life also means exclusion of women from economic life. And that's something you actually have to be able to afford in the first place. If you look at very poor Muslim societies, like even in very restrictive environments like Afghanistan, it's simply not possible to exclude women to that degree from public and economic life. The Gulf states, however, due to the oil wealth that they exist, are actually able to do that. They are able to dispense with the productive capacity of half of their populations, and that's what they do. But it's something that is not readily transposable to many other societies. That I leave to your imagination and to ponder a bit. But at the same time, I'd like you to draw your attention to one of the features that is probably the outcome of the very aggressive Islamization program that many of the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, have engaged in the last decades, which we now see a growing appeal of the Khaliji, the Gulf way of dress, the Gulf way of the particular customary practices with respect to women, that is now growing among many other Muslim societies, and something you can observe for yourself, for example, in the patterns of dress of immigrant Muslim women in Western societies, most of whom are not originating from the Gulf, because these societies are rich, they don't they don't export populations. But you see sometimes now, people who are originating from Pakistan or the Indian subcontinent, who are now dressing like Khaliji women elsewhere. And that is a direct outcome of the growing propagation of the particular practices that have sprang up in the Arabian Peninsula, and are now gaining a greater foothold due to the ability of these states to propagate them due to their oil wealth. And this obviously increases the tensions that we already have among immigrant Muslim societies and their Western hosts, something that we will return to in the next to last week of this course when we talk about Muslim minorities. Here you have an image from Munich, Bavaria, I believe. The key characteristic of all of the societies that we look at this week on the Arabian Peninsula is what I would call the patrimonial welfare state, and the funded by the rentier income from oil and gas. And this patrimonial arrangements we will explore further in a special video later this week. But what is characteristic now is the perpetuation of pre-modern ways of social organization that pay an inordinate amount of importance on descent and lineage, and that are based on a traditional ordering system that evolves around patrimonial duties of care and loyalty on the other hand. So we have a patron-client relationship that is very much unchanged from pre-modern times. And what we see here is a peculiar iteration of what some social scientists have called the Arab social contract. So that the ruling house, the person in charge of the state, can dispose of the state and the income of the state in a quasi-personal manner. So there is an expectation that it's the state and its income and its resources are the personal property of the ruler. But in exchange, he will take care of his subjects, of their economic and social needs. And then in return, they owe him a duty of obedience, and there is no expectation of participation or political involvement in the affairs of the state, but the state will take care of them. So we see here a particular form of an oil-driven welfare state that is far more comprehensive in the types and the degree of services that the state is supposed to provide for its subject than any other welfare state that you might know. And it's important to understand now that the basis for this traditional social arrangement is not peculiar to the Arab or Muslim society. We see here, as you can see in this picture from the European Middle Ages, patron-client relationships and these mutual relationships of duty and care is something we see in many other cultures, perhaps in all cultures. What normally leads to the disintegration of these pre-modern patron-client relationships is that the economic base from which the ruler normally receives the resources that he needs to dispense to those who follow him, his clients, disintegrates, and therefore he's no longer able to keep his part of the bargain. So his clients then are released from their duty of obedience. We see here a picture from Akira Kurosawa's film Ronin, which shows marauding samurais. That we discussed the samurais in the first week of this course. There we have exactly this problem that the old social order in which the shogun would take care of his samurais is now disintegrating, and he's no longer able to provide for them economically, so they are no longer following him obediently. And this economic change that leads to the disintegration of patron-client relationships, that is now not taking place in the Arabian Peninsula, something that we would normally expect. And the reason it does not take place is the discovery of oil and basically free income provided by foreign oil companies that explore this oil, sell it, and pay a fraction of the profits to the local leaders, which they then in turn use to provide patronage to their followers. And here it's important to understand the nature of these economies as rentier economies. And here I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that this characteristic of these economies as rentier economies, i.e. economies that rely to a very large extent, normally more, it's defined as more than, let's say, 40% of their income is from one source, and there is no local input required for that income. This is nothing. This is the key characteristic that defines these economies and therefore their societies and the way they arrange their social affairs. And you already will guess that this is an arrangement that has absolutely nothing to do with religion. It's a point that is Omar Khatouzian in his Political Economy of Modern Iran stresses very much. He says the rentier characteristic of these oil exploring economies is the key characteristic that defines social arrangements and the way the states are built up. And it's something that is completely divorced from the religious nature of these societies. So here we see perhaps the most important social factor that is not linked at all to religion. So if you remember the danger of essentialism that I referred to in the first week, of ascribing to individuals and groups characteristics based on one facet of their being, in our case here, their fact of them being Muslims is misleading, because here perhaps the characteristic of their economies is far more important than the nature of their religious beliefs. If you recall the 4 response patterns that we outlined in the first week of this course, the 4 patterns, the 4 ways a society can respond to the challenge of modernity, they were emulation of the dominant Western ways, Islamic reform, traditionalism, based on the idea that no change is needed, or fundamentalism. And as you can easily imagine now, we are dealing here with societies that have explicitly followed the traditionalist conservative model. They say there's no change needed. And both in social terms and in governmental terms, we are dealing here with states that explicitly claim to be able to perpetuate habits and modes of organization that they have inherited from pre-modern times. So you will now wonder whether what I've told you in the first week is actually accurate, because if you remember, I was referring to the challenge of modernity, the competitive international system, something that Kenneth Waltz in his book Theory of International Politics refers to, that is now imposing a socializing effect on all the units in the system. So as Professor Waltz had pointed out, it says, in a competitive system, innovations that any one unit introduces must be adopted by all the other units, otherwise they face annihilation and they cannot survive in that competitive system. So Professor Waltz had predicted that in this structure, the units would become alike. They would socialize to look like each other. And we have now just discussed that the societies and the states on the Arabian Peninsula are explicitly rejecting change. They do not want to become like the Western nations that are more dominant than they are. So which one is it going to be? Is there a change that is, or the pressure for change that is inevitable, or are they able to isolate themselves? So we're dealing here with societies that explicitly reject the need for change. But what Waltz and any other realist or materialist would predict is that that position is not open to a society in a competitive system. If you don't adopt a competitive economy able to procure the weaponry you needed, if you don't set up a defense force sufficient to protect you, you will not be able to survive in a competitive system. That's what Waltz would predict and what the realists would have accepted. And this is what the Arabian Peninsula seems to contradict. So we're dealing here with a paradox that they apparently seem to be able to survive in a competitive system, in a hostile environment, without adapting to these pressures. And how do we account for this paradox? And there are 2 reasons. One is the relative geographical isolation of these societies. Ever since the 15th century, they were basically left alone by external forces, because there was not much interest by external forces in these areas, because they were relatively poor and relatively remote, and communications were difficult. So their societies could continue unperturbed by external events. That is perhaps the main reason why these societies have not undergone the transformations that we have discussed with respect to Turkey or Egypt or some of the other places. So they remain relatively unchanged well into the 20th century. But what allows them now in the 20th century to continue with their traditional patterns is, on the one hand, the discovery of oil, but more importantly, the protection by external forces that is now given to them. If you looked at the map of the Ottoman possessions at the region, the Ottomans left the interior of the Arabian Peninsula relatively to its own devices. They were not interested. That, as I said, this is the lack of interest in the region. But what you see then in the context of the growing British colonial possession and global empire, the region assumes a certain degree of importance, but not an overwhelming importance, which then leads to the establishment of British protectorates particularly around the coast. So they are now protected by an overarching external hegemon, and therefore can continue with their traditional ways of life without having to worry about defense. And this pattern now continues in the 20th century with the discovery of oil. And now what Walls would predict is that if you have small societies, small states that are not able to defend themselves very well but have lots of wealth, that one of their neighbors would come and gobble them up. And this is exactly what we see in the 1990 invasion of Kuwait. Here's an image from the burning oil fields that the Iraqis set ablaze when they left Kuwait again. But the Kuwait incident also very graphically illustrates exactly the arrangement that explains that paradox. Kuwait did not have to adopt modern ways because it could rely on the United States and its allies to defend it, to protect it, as then happened in the Operation Desert Storm when Kuwait was liberated by foreign forces. Here we see the Saudi commander-in-chief, who was normally put in charge of the Arab forces that that participated in the liberation. And behind him is General Schwarzkopf, whom you see here. And here it's important to note that despite the appearance and the rhetorical posturing of, in this case, the Saudi commander-in-chief, as being on equal footing with the American general, there is absolutely no doubt that the Saudi contribution to this liberation was absolutely marginal. It was only there for political effect. This is an army that is unable to do very much of anything, despite the very advanced weaponry that it possesses. And that's one of the things that we will discover in the context of this week and as we have already discussed last week in the context of Egypt. It is not enough to simply purchase weaponry. You also have to operate them, and in order to do this, you need to have the state machinery and the educational machinery and the training facilities, etc., that go hand in hand and that are necessary to operate these aspects of modern life. That's exactly what Kenneth Walls refers to when he speaks about the socialization tendency of an international system. The Saudis have not done this. So what they have de facto done, they've relied exclusively on the Americans to ensure their defense. And we will now look in the next video, we will look at Ottoman and colonial history as this particular arrangement has developed, how these states have sprang up, how they have been able to divorce themselves from the pressures of an international competitive system. And I look forward to seeing you back then.